All right, guys, back again for the third video of our lecture here. The last thing we were talking about was the split in the era of good feelings. Remember, the Democrat Republicans are going to split into two factions. We're going to have this idea of Jeffersonian democracy. These are the Democrat Republicans. We're just going to refer to them as Republicans from now on. And then we have the Jacksonian democracy, which is going to be Democrats. People should rule directly. So these are the ideas that come after the horrible corrupt bargain thing that happened after John Quincy's election. And remember that 4 years, basically 4 years of his entire presidency was marred by revenge seeking by Jackson and his party. So the campaigning and mudslinging was happening for a long, long time, long before the actual election of Jackson. Okay. Again, to recap, this new idea of democracy, it's based on universal manhood suffrage. We talked about this in class. We talked about how after the American Revolution, the ideas of property for suffrage started to go away. So again, rather than just old property qualifications, we're going to have suffrage start to open up for everyone. Vermont was the first to give the vote to all white males, and then it became sort of a trend nationwide. Okay. Other impacts of this split in the Republican Party, and of course, the increase in suffrage are going to be people are going to pay more close attention to politics. Okay, turnout's going to increase. We go from 25% in 1824, jumping up to 50% in 1825, and then 1840, 78% voted, and that's a huge number. Okay, by comparison, if we look at 2016, the last presidential election that we had, turnout was 55%, which is still very high, I think. Okay, but not as high as it was, say, in 1840. Just a side note, one of the lowest other recorded voter turnouts was during the 1920s, but that's still going to be a lot higher. That was at 49% than it was at 1824. But again, that's early on in our electoral process. Okay, so new ways of politicking: banners, badges, pins, parades, barbecues, free drinks. These are all things that happen to sort of increase activity in voting. Okay. Actually, also members of the Electoral College were chosen directly by the people for the first time. Before this, they were chosen by state legislatures. So let's talk about Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, as we've talked about before, was a war hero. Okay, his very strong defeat of the British at the Battle of New Orleans. Remember, there were over 2,000 British lost, and something like 80 Americans actually lost at the Battle of New Orleans. He was a hero in Florida against the Native Americans, even though it was, we look back and we think it's an unjust war, but he was considered a hero in Florida versus the Seminoles in that first Seminole War. He was the first president from the West, and we're going to consider Tennessee the West. And he was the first president to be nominated at the first formal party convention. This was in Baltimore, Maryland in 1832. And he was the first president who was without a college education, except for George Washington. Here's a picture of Old Hickory. Some other interesting facts about Jackson. The Hermitage was his home. He actually had been involved in many duels. Actually had 2 bullets still in his body from duels. Very patriotic, obviously a military career. Before he was president, he was a judge, a congressman, a military leader. He was the military governor of Spanish Florida. He also was a House of Representative member and also a senator from Tennessee. But he was very suspicious of federal government. So I guess if you had to characterize him back in the days of anti-federalist and federalist, he'd probably be on the side of the anti-federalist, which is going to shock you in a minute when we talk about how he felt about federal government power over the states' rights. But again, even Jefferson felt that way. He was an anti-federalist, but he realized that you needed a strong central government to get things done. So, and other things about Andrew Jackson, he was against the American system of Henry Clay. He ignored Supreme Court sometimes. He dominated the Congress with the veto. We say dominated the Congress. He had 12 vetoes, which, if you look at history, we've had presidents who had a whole lot more vetoes than that. But this is considered a huge number at the time. He gets the nickname King Andrew the First, basically saying that he's going to veto whatever his policies come first over that of Congress. And then his inauguration was a pretty nice deal, too. Over 21,000 people showed up to this inauguration. And there was a huge inauguration, big party. Jackson himself, from what I was researching, he actually had to sneak in and out because the party was so crazy. So here's a picture, or a painting rather, of the inaugural party. Looks pretty packed to me. Okay. And you can see in the background, old hickory back here. Okay, so some impacts of his election. He's going to start what we call the spoils system, which is also known as patronage, Patronage. And basically, what that means is if a political leader wins an office, then they can sort of fill the cabinet and fill government positions with their supporters. So this was a problem for Thomas Jefferson. He didn't have this ability. So this patronage, also known as a spoils, starts in 1829. And so, again, Jefferson didn't have this. And so he's famously saying is, we're going to throw the rascals out and put our rascals in. He again was suspicious of the national government, but at least he could put people that supported him in positions of power. Okay, his cabinet was very mediocre, as you would imagine, because he's going to appoint a lot of these people and friends of these people. He didn't have the strongest cabinet. An exception, though, was Martin Van Buren. He became Secretary of State. Remember, we talked about Secretary of State having a lot of power. He actually was a very efficient Secretary of State, later becomes president. And then he really didn't like his cabinet a whole lot. And again, you don't get to appoint all your cabinet, so you can appoint some people to positions. Make sure you understand that about the spoils system. But he really went to sort of an unofficial cabinet who really were the people he wanted in government positions to give him advice. So this unofficial group of Jackson advisors is known as the kitchen cabinet. He really listened to them more than he did to the actual cabinet members. Okay, the Peggy Eaton affair. Okay, this is gonna shocking stuff. So we're gonna talk about this Peggy Eaton. She's responsible for basically destroying Jackson's entire cabinet in 1831. And the story is a long one, but I'm going to try to shorten it for you. This affair is also known as the Petticoat Affair. And basically, it all stems from an unlawful marriage, if you want to call it that, or a scandalous marriage. And remember, Jackson sort of faced some of this himself because his wife had not completely divorced yet when they got married, which caused a big scandal back in his attempt or his actual campaigning to run for president. So Secretary of War John Eaton, he is going to marry a woman named Peggy O'Neill. Okay, Peggy O'Neill, she ran a boarding house, and her first husband, his name was John Timberlake. So before John Eaton and Peggy O'Neill got married, John Timberlake was out on the seas, and actually, according to the research I read, John Eaton tried to help John Timberlake with some debts and things like this. So obviously, John Eaton became very close with Peggy, and also was kind of showing her around town in Washington while John Timberlake, the sailor, was out at sea. Well, sadly, John Timberlake dies out at sea, but she had already been sort of going around Washington and talking to important figures and being politically involved with discussions with Eaton, who was a senator at that time before her husband's death. So this is kind of scandalous in itself. And so because of this, Jackson sort of like takes an interest in her, not romantically, but basically, you got to remember that this woman is kind of an outsider, and now all this negative publicity is going towards her because she's politically involved, and there's a scandal involved with how she got married or whatever. And remember, Andrew Jackson's wife was treated the same way, so he kind of feels bad for her, so he kind of supports her. And basically, Peggy Eaton wanted to be involved in sort of the social life with the first ladies, not ladies as in the president's wife, because remember his wife is dead, but the senators' wives and the representatives' wives and things like that. And so this becomes a big deal. These women who were against Peggy Eaton are called the petticoats. Okay, it's kind of an unofficial slang term. They're kind of high society, and they look down on Peggy Eaton. And so basically, what happens is the women want to snub her. And so they talk to their husbands, and John Calhoun, his wife is probably the biggest one. She wants Peggy Eaton gone. Andrew Jackson supports Peggy Eaton. And so almost the entire cabinet of of Andrew Jackson resigns because of this whole affair. So this whole event becomes known as a petticoat affair. Again, all because of Jackson's support of this woman, Eaton, who happened to be harassed and happened to have somewhat of a scandal in how she got married to Senator John Eaton. Okay. So again, like I just said, here's Peggy Eaton. Here's John Eaton. Andrew Jackson had supported Eaton. Martin Van Buren also had supported Eaton. It's interesting that Van Buren was also a widower. And of course, this whole affair was a big rift between Andrew Jackson and John Calhoun. John Calhoun resigned the next year. In 1830, Andrew Jackson also found out that John Calhoun was one of the ones who wanted to get him in trouble after his whole first Seminole War in Florida. Like, if you go back and look at history, in 1818, John Calhoun tried to censure Andrew Jackson. So we find out that the president and the vice president have never got along really, but they were working together. But now this whole Peggy Eaton affair is going to like drive a wedge between both of them. So again, the followers of John Calhoun, they're going to leave the cabinet in 1831 and 1832. John Calhoun resigns, and he's going to enter the Senate from South Carolina. Okay. So Andrew Jackson then appoints Van Buren, who becomes the minister to England. Van Buren actually becomes his vice president. Eaton becomes the governor of Florida. Vice President Calhoun was in line for the president. Because of this break, though, with Andrew Jackson, his hopes for being president kind of die down. Okay. And so, of course, this is going to foreshadow what's going to come. But Calhoun becomes more sectionalist. You can see where this is leading to. Okay. All right, we're going to stop here for a second and we'll do one last video and finish up with Andrew Jackson.